The spooky season is upon us, and what better way to enjoy it than with a nice and cozy horror-themed game of D&D or similar tabletop RPG. It all sounds very nice, but horror isn't an easy genre to pull off, especially not a TTRPG. You are trying to invoke a very powerful feeling in people, that of dread, and that's always a challenge to pull off. In movies, you can rely on sound effects and shocking visuals, and in books you have the leisure of building tension over dozens of pages. But how do you do it when you sit around a table and it's all on you? As we often do in these videos, we'll break the challenge of horror down into its components and then look at them in turn, which will hopefully make it more manageable. As such, horror can be roughly divided into 3 parts: atmosphere, tension building, and spooks. I've listed them in the order that I think they should be introduced in your game because one builds on the next. Atmosphere supports the building of tension, and the tension allows the spooks to be satisfying. Without atmosphere, tension building becomes extremely difficult, and without tension, the spooks become cheap parlor tricks. We'll also look a bit at combat in horror, but for now, let's look at building atmosphere. Atmosphere is the foundation of horror in any story, and likely the only part that can stand on its own. If you have nothing but atmosphere in your game, it'll still make an impact. Like, players are likely to remember that weird one-shot that didn't really have anything to do with horror, but still had that heavy, spooky feeling to it for some reason. The most important part of atmosphere is to put your players into a state of mind, which we can call the spooky mind. It's a state of mind where your brain becomes overly sensitive to potential threats, where suddenly a tree in the dark looks like an unnaturally tall man, or the sound of a cat sounds eerie. Basically, when in the spooky mind, your brain jumps to conclusions that are far scarier than what it would normally do. We typically get into this mindset when the atmosphere is right, when it's night and we can't see beyond the first row of trees in the forest, or when we are in an old building that has all these haunted tales attached to its history. So how do you get the players into the spooky mind? There are a few types of atmosphere building that you can use. The first and easiest kind is the meta-atmosphere, which concerns everything that the players feel in real life as they sit down at a table or their computer. Music and ambience is the easiest to prepare, and this works both for online and live games. Dimming the light in the room that you're playing in is another way, and if you're playing online, you can ask your players to dim the lights in their own rooms to help with the atmosphere. Also, I find in live sessions that candles are pretty much a must for a horror game. You can spread them out in the room and even mix candles with different burn times so that they begin to go out on their own during the game. More advanced things are the type of snacks that you bring to the table. If you can make a Victorian style cherry pie for a gothic horror game, it'll probably help with atmosphere more than a bag of crisps. And you can decorate the room with things like fake cobwebs, weird masks, pumpkins, if you enjoy the kind of decor effort. Whether you go for just the music or the whole room decor shebang, you should make sure that you do the other part of meta-atmosphere, talking about expectations with your players. Horror is a very easy genre to break with jokes and foolery, so make sure that everyone at the table knows that they are expected to help build, maintain the atmosphere, and stay immersed, which means cutting back on the jokes and allowing yourself to be spooked. And it's not to say that there can't be fun in a horror game, far from it, only that no one should pursue it in the way they would in a normal game. Funnily absurd situations might still arise, but try to hold back on the funny comments and such for the sake of immersion. In short, make sure that you have a group of players who are in it for the horror and are stoked about being spooked. Setting atmosphere is where you, perhaps shockingly, build atmosphere through the setting. It doesn't deal with the actual story of the game or anything like that, but only with the location where the game takes place. It could be a classic haunted house or a spooky castle or the dark woods or any other place where you want this game to be set. Starting with the basics, think about the time of the day that the game takes place in. There's no shame in sticking to the tropes and setting the game at night, but you might have an idea that would make other times of the day work. Maybe the game starts at twilight, light fades as the game progresses, or you have a way to make bright daylight work for you. Just make sure that if you're straying from the tried and true, do it with a plan. Another thing to consider for the setting is the weather. Again, the trope of tropes is the dark night with rain and thunder, and that's because it works really well. There's something cozy about inside when the weather's terrible, and for some reason, spooky and cozy has always walked hand in hand. Think of how Halloween is a celebration of the scary, but it's done in a comfy way with friends and treats. Or the old tradition of telling ghost stories at Christmas, which basically mixes the peak of coziness with the spooky. Weather can also make the players feel more isolated when they explore a setting. A heavy snowstorm might trap them in a house, or thunder and lightning might make the woods around the castle too scary to brave. Rain pounding on the windows can feel like nature itself is pushing in against the fragile shelter that they're hiding in. Ominous winds, sandstorms, dense fog, there are many options. And they might be made even more effective if they're used in unexpected places. For example, if we have this heavy, dense fog descend upon the desert, or maybe we have broiling lightning in the sky when gentle snow is falling. No matter if you choose the weather for yourself or if it's chosen by the module you're running, remember to include it as often as possible, since even the most well-written module might not mention the weather as much as it should. Remind the players how the rain whips on the windows, or how the thunder makes the entire house shake. Speaking of area descriptions, let's look closer at that. Whether you're writing a horror module for yourself or for others to run, you'll probably want to write area descriptions of the different places that the players can explore, unless you're some kind of improvisational goddess or something. These descriptions are the most direct way to add atmosphere to your setting. And if we stick with the weather for a moment, let's look at how we can include the weather in a more interesting way than just mentioning that it's raining once in a while. We want the weather to do things and not just be there in the background. So here are some examples. If we want to include rain in the description, we could have a room where the window is open and rain is pouring in, soaking the carpet. This mentions the rain, but also adds something unique to the room. It might even be tied into the room below, where the players found this odd dripping of water coming through the ceiling. Another example, if we want to bring attention to the thunderstorm, one room might be conspicuously quiet, while all the other rooms in the castle are rattled by the thunder. If we have snow, we can have ominous words scrawled in it on the balcony or something. The sound of rain on the roof windows in the conservatory might literally be deafening to the player characters, perhaps just serving as an intense reminder of the weather, or maybe posing a unique challenge in some kind of combat encounter. If the character is out on the roof, a ball of lightning might strike a statue, deforming its face in a creepy way. Moving on from the weather, you can build spooky atmosphere in your descriptions by adding strange details that will put the player's mind on the edge. For example, while walking on a flight of stairs, one of the steps might creak in a way that sounds more like a back cracking than wood creaking. Or a door opens with a sigh that sounds oddly human, leaving the players to wonder if there's actually a spirit trapped in the door, or if it's just a strange choice of words. One room might be described as significantly colder than the others around it, for no apparent reason. Or a corridor might be uncomfortably narrow, having larger player characters' shoulders brush against both walls. You basically want to provoke the following line of thoughts in your players. Something is strange in this room, like it's really cold in here. Then, that doesn't seem to be an explanation for it, which leads to, could it be something paranormal? You want to add details that make the players think, why is that so? Why is all the furniture covered with drapes, except for that one armchair that is facing away from us? Is someone or something sitting in it? Or why do our footsteps seem to echo a little too long when no other sounds does that? There will be reasonable answers to these questions. Maybe the cold room has a problem with draft. Someone simply forgot to cover that armchair. Or maybe the footsteps are a bit more of a distinct sound than the others, making them stand out more. But what if? What if the logical explanation isn't the right one? And that is where you want your players' minds to go. The last part of atmosphere building I will talk about is a backstory atmosphere. If atmosphere is the foundation of horror, then backstory is the foundation of atmosphere. Which means I should probably put this in the beginning of the section, but here we are. In the introduction of this video, I talked about how a place that already has a ghost story is more likely to put your mind in the spooky mind than a place with a clean reputation. And this is what backstory atmosphere is all about. The reputation that precedes the place that the players are going to. There are two kinds of backstory atmosphere. The general one that paints the broad strokes of the haunting, and the more specific stuff that foreshadows potential events. Here are some examples of creating backstory atmosphere in a general sense. Simple things like, when the player characters are heading to the old house, someone mentions that how locals have been hearing strange sounds from this house during moonless nights. Or they hear how travelers in the forest have seen dark shapes moving amongst the trees at twilight. in that old castle they're heading to? Oh, no one lives there, and yet people hear a bell tolling during thunderstorms, like the one that's brewing right now. In short, before the players get to the place, they need to know that it is haunted, and hear some kind of story that proves the point. You can then move on to the more specific stuff. Maybe the player characters are told that there's some special locked door in the house, and that if you knock on it, someone or something knocks back. Or the classic, if you whistle in the woods, you might hear something whistle back. Or at a certain time of the night, a ghost apparition can be seen in the clock tower window. Maybe there's this children's rhyme that if you say it out loud at the base of the tower, you can hear tiny footsteps following you around. While these little stories might be chilling on their own, as the players imagine going through them themselves, their true power comes when the player characters actually find that locked door in the house. They can just decide to leave it be, or choose to interact with it, in accordance with what they've heard in the story. And then we'll see what happens, and what consequences that bring. Unlike the general backstory, these specific ones has an element of agency in them that allows the players to test out the haunting. They can deliberately stake out the clock tower to see if the apparition actually appears as foretold, or if they're brave, maybe even hide in the clock tower itself to be close to the apparition. This gives the players a kind of goal in the exploration that is entirely tied to the theme of horror. They build atmosphere, but also might become some fun interactive part of the game. Now, you should at least have an idea or two about how to create atmosphere for the game, so let us look at building tension. Tension is the feeling of dread and unease the players feel when they explore the haunted house, or the scary old woods. It's kind of similar to atmosphere building, except tension building is much more active. It happens only during the game itself, and through events that directly affect the player characters. At its core, tension comes from the feeling that something is out to get you, whether it's actively hunting you or simply prowling around for you to accidentally stumble into. It's a rising sense of danger. The first method of building tension is to make the players feel that something is aware of them, something they don't know what is. Maybe they can hear music playing behind a locked door, or someone singing very friendly. But the moment they open the door, that sound stops. Something is clearly reacting to their actions. Or a door slides open on its own accord just before the characters can reach it, as if inviting them in. Or it can be an ominous message like words written on the dust on an old desk that says, "She knows you're here." Even better if the message appears on the surface that the players are sure were undisturbed the last time they checked. Or maybe they hear footsteps thrashing through the room that they just left without any possible explanation on how anyone got in behind them. Or a smoking candle in a room that the players just entered, suggesting that someone or something just blew it out before they entered. All these little events must be of a kind that can't simply be explained away by the wind or some other phenomena. Even if the candle was blown out by the draft caused by the door opening, something must still have lit it. Something made those footstep sounds, and someone played that piano. The players must be left to wonder, what did it, and what does it want? Another way of tension building is by pushing the players to a place that they perceive as dangerous. Even if there's no real danger, them thinking there is will increase the tension with each step they take. Here are some examples of these dangerous places. The dark basement is a classic, and hardly needs any foreshadowing for the players to feel the rising tension with each step down the stairs they go. Other places might become dangerous through the backstory. Maybe an NPC mentioned how people who venture out onto the lake in the middle of the forest come back mad or even forever insane. And now, for some convenient reason, the player characters need to go out on the lake on their own, each oar stroke filled with mounting dread. A mundane place like a corridor might become dangerous through the addition of monstrous claw marks on the walls and the floor, meaning that walking down said corridor is literally like walking in the footsteps of the monster. Or maybe the characters saw something scary through one of the windows from the outside, and while exploring the house, they suddenly realize that they are now in that very same room. The order of tension building should be with the little events first, followed by the dangerous place, which pushes the tension to the breaking point, where we will then, finally, look at spooks. So let's talk about spooks. Now that the atmosphere has prepared the players by putting them into the spooky mindset, and the tension has brought them to the edge of their seats, it's time to spring a spook on them. That not only scares them, but also resets the tension so we can start rebuilding it from the ground up again. If the tension is allowed to linger for too long, it'll lose its steam, deflate, and we don't want that. Now, if atmosphere hints at what lurks in the haunted house, and the tension turns those hints into imagined threats in players' minds, the spooks are where the players finally get a glimpse of the horror. A classic type of spook is the jump scare, but they aren't easily pulled off in a D&D game. You can try to do it in the way that movies does it, by playing loud sound effects, perhaps by a hidden speaker somewhere, prepped to fire off a scream or something. But a more reliable and less sensory grating way is to do it with a shocking turn of events. These events yank the carpet out from under the players' feet so rapidly that the players will be scrambling to comprehend what just happened and what is still happening, depriving them at least for a moment of that sense of control that protects them. For example, imagine that the characters are making their way down the stairs to the basement, the tension building with every step they take. Then, suddenly, spectral hands reach out from the walls on all sides, grabbing the first character and dragging them downstairs into the dark basement, out of sight. None of the players know what happened, or if it could happen again, and they didn't even get a saving throw. The point here is that the players are used to having agency in most events, even trap-like situations like these. So when they're suddenly completely helpless to react, it hopefully shakes their understanding of how the game works. It's a shocking moment that reveals how vulnerable they are. Another example, a sudden change of conditions. Maybe the player characters open an old steamer trunk in the attic which belonged to a drowned sailor. And, as the lock clicks, the trunk springs open, letting out a hoarse scream as icy water pours out, flooding the floor in an instant. Maybe there are even spooky reflections on the surface of the water. The idea here is to jolt the players from a tense moment of exploration into a sudden and unfamiliar situation with unknown threats. Maybe something is lurking in the water, something evil that grabs at the angles. Also, a spook is a good moment to initiate combat. Tension has been building, and suddenly a door slams shut, separating half of the party from the other, just as the curtains begin to billow wildly and unseen hands assault the hapless characters. Here, the shock comes from the sudden move from exploration to combat, against an opponent that the players might not even recognize or know how to deal with yet. Just as sudden loud noises are scary because you didn't expect them, and they might signify a threat that you're not prepared for, these jolting events put the players into a sudden situation they are not prepared for. Now, spooks don't have to affect the player characters as directly as those mentioned before. It can be more of a soft threat, like the sudden appearance of something horrifying that let the players know that the feeling of being watched was true, and now something is coming for them, and fast. Maybe the players have made their way down a long corridor to a haunted bedroom, and when they enter, they hear a sound. As they turn, they see an unusually tall woman at the end of the corridor, striding silently towards them with this unnatural speed and an expression of quiet rage on her face. The players might try to fight, or they might be so scared that they just flee, resulting in a harrowing chase that will then result with them hopefully making it out. Or maybe one of the player characters have felt watched for a long time, and suddenly a mirror in the room bursts, revealing a huge staring eye behind it, completely upending the player's perception of what is safe and not in this house. Even if they attack and cut the eye into a bloody mess, the experience should still leave them shocked and on edge, and now every reflective surface in the house seems unsafe. No matter what spook you make, it should always, ideally, answer a question, like what happens if you go down the stairs to the basement? What is behind that feeling of being watched? Who is making that sound of those footsteps? But once such questions have been answered, the spook should also raise a new question, like, where was our companion taken? Is this whole house a monstrous creature? Who is the tall woman? Is something watching behind the very reflection of the eyes of my companions? Answering and raising new questions ensures that the spooks have been foreshadowed and they don't just feel like cheap scares, since the players will learn something from them. Setup, payoff, and a new setup. Ideally, the new question should be more disturbing than last, culminating in the finale of the game. Most of the things mentioned so far could just as easily have been applied to a horror story you're writing, or a movie you're watching, or even some spooky music. But in this part, we'll look at something that is distinctively part of most tabletop RPGs: combat. Especially in a D&D game, combat is bound to be a significant part of the game. But how do you keep the tension and sense of horror when people are slinging spells and swinging swords? After all, weapons give you a sense of power and control, which are completely opposed to the feeling of being scared. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the key to combat horror is the opponent. It might be tempting to treat a hostile creature like a ghost or ghoul, like a normal encounter once it has been triggered. Maybe you added some spooky abilities to them, but they still obey the basic rules of combat. In order to keep the eeriness beyond the initiative roll, however, you need to go a bit further. This eeriness can come from what follows a successful attack against a creature. Maybe when the ghoul is struck by a mace, the brown blood smeared on the spikes of the weapon begins to crawl down the length of the weapon towards the character's hands. Or when a firebolt hits a ghost, spectral flames rise up from the apparition, which the player character can feel as if it was on their own body. Or maybe a well-placed arrow feels like a sucker punch in the stomach of the player character who made the attack. Eeriness can also come from the way that a combat encounter ends. Maybe from one turn to the next, all the animated skeletons vanish, leaving the players to wonder if they were ever really there, or something that their characters imagined. Or an otherwise corporeal-looking monster suddenly rises off the floor and passes through the ceiling, leaving no mark or passage behind. This is both strange, but also leaves the players with this problem of having a monster on the loose without knowing where it is or when it could strike again. Or, in the middle of a fight, a ghost embeds itself in one of the characters, not possessing them and controlling them in the normal sense, but just kind of hiding inside them, maybe to peek out at a creepy moment or something like that. A less eerie, but also effective way to keep the horror in combat is to force the players to flee. Players are used to be able to win a fight, and probably less acquainted with retreating, which makes them feel more vulnerable when they actually have to do it. If you do this, it should be quite clear that the battle is unwinnable, and preferably early on so the players don't feel like you're wasting their time. One way to do this is by having tentacles reach out of an old tree trunk in the forest, clearly far too numerous for them to fight, so it's very clear that this is not a winnable situation. Or maybe weapons and spells pass harmlessly through the apparition, or the skeletons keep reforming themselves every time they're smashed apart, perhaps into increasingly grotesque and horrifying shapes. In this kind of encounter, the excitement doesn't come from trying to overcome an enemy, but figuring out how to escape it. So make sure that this goal is quite clear as early as possible. All in all, these eerie additions are meant to prevent combat from feeling like a safe and comfortable place in the game, where the rules are familiar and everyone waits patiently on their turn. The players must feel very quickly that the rules cannot be depended upon, and whatever horror is facing them is toying with them. Of course, you shouldn't go so far that the players don't feel like they're playing a game anymore, but just enough to make them doubt themselves and wonder what is going to happen next. The last thing you can do with horror combat is to tie it into the exploration part of the game by adding some kind of weakness to the hostile creatures that the players can exploit, if they have been exploring enough to actually know it. Maybe a ghost is only vulnerable to the knife that killed it in life, so if the players have been exploring and figuring out the story of the ghost, and then maybe finding that dagger, they'll have an advantage in that fight. Or if the players explore and find this old grimoire in the library and actually look through it, they'll know that the touch of flames is the only thing that prevents the ghouls from coming back. Or you could even have a sort of cleansing ritual that banishes the evil spirit that would otherwise be undefeatable in a straight-up fight. You can weave combat into the ritual by having part of it require the monster to be caught 3 times with a special dagger or something like that. And this could be a great way to have this grand finale of the scenario. It'll give the characters some kind of objective as they explore, like maybe they need to find the book that explains the ritual, and then they need to find the knife, and so on. Basically, giving them something to look for as they explore this haunted place. So to summarize it all, first, make sure that you have the atmosphere in place. Make sure that the setting has some spooky backstory and maybe some small stories that can be foreshadowing events to come when the players explore the place. Then when you're building tension, make sure that you start with little events that put the players on edge, things that can't easily be explained away by natural phenomena, and then push them to this place of danger where they feel like every step they take brings them closer to whatever horror is waiting for them, and then spring a spook. This could be just some intense moment where a character is yanked away from the group, or the situation changes completely, or suddenly all the lights in the house goes on, everyone is blinded by this and they begin to hear voices or something like that. Something very strange. Or it can be the initiation of combat. And then, when you're doing horror combat, remember to keep it eerie. Remember, this is not supposed to be the run-of-the-mill combat encounter where everything is fair and everything's by the book. No, this is horror. So here, the rules are strange. I hope that you can use some of this to run a spooky horror game for the coming season. I think I noticed when I wrote the script that I wrote something like players wandering a lot of times. And I guess that lies at the heart of what a horror game is. When the players wonder about something, their minds will begin to wander. And if you have prepared them with the proper atmosphere, they might wander to scary places, or something like that. If you're looking for a good horror scenario to run for this spooky season, or some other time, if you enjoy horror outside of October, as I do, I can recommend the Haunted House scenario in Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. I ran it a couple of years ago, and it's a solid foundation for a spooky game. We started in October and ended in December, so. Or you can pick up a Haunted House scenario that I wrote a few years ago. I will put the link to my DM skill page in the description. It's called The Haunting of Hersey Manor, and it is filled to the brim with spooks and dark history for the players to uncover. Apart from that, if you want to support the channel, the best way you can do that is by giving this video a like and drop a comment below. Maybe share a ghost story if you have any run-ins with the paranormal. I'll leave one of my own to get it started. And subscribe if you want to catch the next video, which I think is going to be a little more light than the last few videos. I'm thinking something like making physical handouts and props for your live games. So stay tuned and take care of yourself. Have a nice spooky season, and I will see you. Goodbye!